Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. Empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your co-host, Joanne Leon.
And on today's show, April 13th, 2017, we interview Peter Lee, a.k.a. China Hand, on U.S.-China relations in the age of Donald Trump. Here is that interview.
Peter Lee, also known as China Hand, is the proprietor of the China Matters website and the host of NewsBud Independent Media's weekly China Watch webcast. He's been watching China for over 40 years, first as a businessman in China and then as an analyst and commentator. His work has appeared at Counterpunch, Japan Focus, Asia Times, and the South China Morning Post. Hello, Peter. Welcome to Around the Empire. It's great to have you.
Hey, Pete.
It's great to be here, Joanne and Dan.
So we watched your latest China Watch segment, and we have interesting times right now with China. I thought maybe we'd talk about the Xi Jinping visit and whether or not China really did enjoy the beautiful chocolate cake. Maybe some on the cruise missile strikes and Syria reconstruction. And then also on North Korea. So hopefully we can fit all that into the time that we have together. Why don't you give us a little overview for people who haven't watched that segment yet, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Can you give us your assessment on the Xi Jinping's visit here and whether he did enjoy the beautiful chocolate cake?
Well, I don't think he enjoyed the chocolate cake too much. The theme of my video is Trump treated Xi Jinping as a second banana, who was there basically to enjoy a performance of Donald Trump's military awesomeness. You know, the famous story about the chocolate cake is that Trump, as they were enjoying, as he put it, a beautiful piece of chocolate cake, he leaned over to Xi and told him that he was cruise missiling the crap out of Syria. And, that's the sort of unscripted event that Chinese leaders really don't like when they come to the United States. They like everything to be sort of set up and orderly. But more to the point, I think that that was the key event in the meeting because it demonstrated to Xi Jinping that Donald Trump is not Barack Obama in that he's quite happy to use American power unilaterally, extra-legally, and without warning. So that's, I think, the message he took back.
Yeah, and not only that, but to use it as a tool of diplomacy, if you could call it that. You know, I'm not sure if it was meant to, like you said, to call him a second banana or to belittle or intimidate the man. I'm generally not very sympathetic to Xi Jinping. I don't really have strong feelings about him either way. But I found myself feeling kind of sorry for that guy, wondering basically how I would have felt if I had been put in that position. And I'm pretty sure that I would want to say as little as possible and get the heck out of there as quickly as I could. I also wonder what Xi's, ministers and his, whatever you call his cabinet, what they were thinking at that time. I mean, I can't imagine the reaction in China.
Well, I think that, the reaction was that we have the famous madman theory, which Donald Trump, I think, is an aficionado of when it comes to his dealings with China. He always wants to leave his interlocutors with the anxiety that he might just do something totally nutso in terms of using military force and retaliating. And after Xi got back to China, he apparently did make a phone call to Donald Trump to assure him that he was going to that China was going to do something about North Korea. And also, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but on Syria, China abstained from the Syria resolution on the chemical attack thing instead of joining Russia to do a veto, which I took also as a sign that Xi Jinping's team is saying, let's accommodate Donald Trump for now. Let's not go up against him on this issue of Syria, which I thought actually was rather significant.
The UN Security Council, yeah, I did notice that. I'd have to go back and look at the record. Only one has to veto it, obviously, but yeah, they could have voted no at least.
Yeah,
well, that would have been a veto.
They vetoed the last one. And China's representative to the UN has been quite unambiguous in China's insistence that before people throw cruise missiles out there and start condemning Assad, that there should be an investigation of the attack. And I don't think that's changed at all. The only thing I think that changed was that Xi Jinping wanted to extend some sort of conciliatory gesture towards Donald Trump by not going against the United States and the other members of the Security Council in openly vetoing that resolution.
Right, and China does have people in Syria. They have, I'm not sure if they have any actual military there, but I know that they have people training medics and other resources, and they are gearing up for a very, very large reconstruction project. So they have a strong interest. There was a recent interview, Assad did an interview with Chinese media, and they talked about a few things, but I would say at least half the interview focused on reconstruction in China. And the journalist asked Assad, well, what would you want China to be involved with? And Assad's like, China can do anything they want in reconstruction. I don't know if you saw that interview. It was very conciliatory. And, a lot of people are interested in reconstruction in Syria, which is interesting. Going all the way back to 2013. In fact, before Obama said that he was going to do regime change strikes, basically in August, September of 2013, some 4 or 5 months before that, April of 2013, this story didn't get a lot of coverage, but General Wesley Clark hooked up with an investment fund that was focused on Syria reconstruction, which I thought was curious, very sort of prescient of him. I guess that didn't work out because now it's been 4 years. But even back then, and then also Boris Johnson in London was very interested in reconstruction of Palmyra because it's an ancient site. And anyway, reconstruction's mentioned a lot, but China seems to be the front runner on.
Everybody talks a good game about reconstruction, but it's I've seen estimates that it's going to cost $1 trillion to put Syria back together again. And the important thing was that whenever things got fucked up in the Middle East before, it used to be Saudi Arabia, and the GCC countries that would step up, places like Lebanon and so on. But they're not interested in helping out Assad. And I don't think Iran, which is his closest ally in the region, has the financial heft to do it. So, yeah, I think everybody is saying that, everybody wants contracts for reconstruction if we move into a post-conflict era. But the only people who are going to be able to finance that is China. And I think China recently put out a video on its One Belt, One Road project, which actually includes a vignette from Syria, which you normally don't see nowadays. And I think that was a pretty clear message that China, because of geostrategic and also internal economic reasons, is ready to do a big, big deal in Syria. But they have to be able to go in and do it, and Assad has to stay. And so it's an interesting geopolitical thing.
And isn't that, Peter, a larger, I rember seeing, because one of the few people I've actually been following the Afghanistan war, the endless war in Afghanistan. And I remember there being this kind of frantic report about how Afghanistan actually had all these mineral resources, right? I don't know if you remember this report about selenium or some other things, but in fact, China owned it, that it was a Chinese firm that owned it. And that, the U.S. had once again gotten roped in to provide up any security for Afghanistan. I don't know how true that report was. It got a lot of mainstream play because it kind of played to a narrative of, the dumb pitiful giant, to go back to Nixonian madman theory. The pitiful giant, the Americans are in there fighting the Taliban and the insurgents, cashing in on these mineral resources. But I just want to pivot from that point while you respond to that and say, is China doing in the Middle East what it's doing in Africa and other parts of the world, which is grabbing resources for its expanding economy, or is that mostly hype?
Well, there's, in terms of resources in the Middle East, the only resources in the Middle East that China is interested in are oil and gas, and those are major strategic issues for them. I think that China lifts more oil from Iraq than any other country. I think the primary purchaser now of both Saudi and Iranian crude. So that, I think, is the alpha and omega for China's interests there. in Afghanistan, the most important Chinese interest there is the copper mine at Mes Aynak, and I'm sure I don't know if you watched that thrilling documentary about how there's this ancient Buddhist archaeological site in the middle of the copper mine. But China has basically signed an agreement to develop that mine, and because the demand for copper has declined in China since they signed that agreement, now they're slow walking it. But China does use agreements to develop mineral projects in places like Afghanistan and Africa as geopolitical placeholders. They deny those resources to other people, and also they attract the desperate attention of the local government, which is waiting for China to put a few $1 billion into those projects to develop them. But I think the general rap on China and Afghanistan is misplaced. Basically, I think the Chinese realized that the U.S. strategy to try to defeat the Taliban was futile, and now, and I think it was a relatively unreported story, I think the United States has come around to that understanding, and that's necessary to bring the Taliban into the Kabul government. And I'm sure you saw the thing about the mega bomb that got dropped on ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan this morning.
This morning, yep.
Yeah. And
biggest non-nuclear explosion in history, right?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of hoo-haing about this, how this is just more Donald Trump dick measuring. But I think that a theme that I have been pushing in my pieces recently is that Donald Trump and the U.S. uniformed military are very much on the same page, that they want to knock down ISIS, not just in Syria and Iraq, but also all those foreign fighters, and there are thousands of them, are going to be returning to Central Asia. They'll be looking for havens in Afghanistan. And I think that this attack on ISIS Khorasan with the big bomb was probably part of that, in that they want to obliterate a ISIS haven in Afghanistan so that the fighters don't have a convenient place to go. Also, the other thing is that the United States financed the construction of gigantic underground tunnel complexes in that part of Afghanistan. And it's quite possible that if you're really serious about wanting to take them out, I mean, these were places that were big enough to park a tank in. In fact, I was reading about one of them at Jawa, and they actually, these caverns go for, half a mile into the middle of a mountain, and they were big enough that they actually stored the Russian tanks. The Mujahideen stored the Russian tanks that they had acquired in those caverns to drive them out when they needed to. So, it might be that they actually did need a huge bomb to take out one of those caverns.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, that was, I can't help but think went on to Meet the Press and describe these underground labyrinths and all these things, but some of that was actually true. Some of the stuff they talked about with Bin Laden seemed completely outlandish.
That's the point. We know exactly where they are. We built them for the Mujahideen against the Soviets.
Ah, right. Okay, so it's kind of like Saddam's chemical weapons. Like, how could he not have them? We gave them to him.
Yeah. So the Russians, the Soviets fought some pitched battles, involving whole, battalions and regiments trying to go in there and take out these caverns. So anyway, when I saw that thing, I wasn't thinking, well, they just want to make a big noise in eastern Afghanistan. I'm thinking, maybe the ISIS Khorasan had taken over some of those old first-class caverns, and it was the United States finally decided they would, as we say, retire them.
That's a good point. What about the other part of the question that maybe you would have a unique insight into? What about the idea of China's more global strategy, moving out of the Middle East for a second, that because unlike the U.S., now, in fairness, the U.S. there's a law in the books called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So a lot of American companies can't, in theory at least, do a lot of these business deals where they do kicks beyond the customs level. There's actually an exemption. But China apparently has, not only does it not have any real provisions against bribing local officials or national officials in Africa and elsewhere, it also has none. It doesn't do these little lectures that America likes to do on human rights and other things like that. And so what it seems to be from reports I've read is that developing country governments that may be kleptocracies are much more inclined to work with China than even Europe, which doesn't have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Is that true at all, or is that overstated? What's your read on that?
Well, I don't personally engage in African corruption, but I think that is definitely the case. There are regimes down there in Africa. They're very happy to deal with China because there's none of this knuckle rapping over corruption, and it was also true, of the Japanese when they went into these resource-rich countries back in the day. The United States and Europe are on sort of one camp, and the Koreans and the Asians and the Chinese are sort of in the other camp. That you gotta go along to get along, and you have to do some payoffs. So, I'm not saying I know anything, but it seems to me quite likely that there are governments of that ilk. And also the other thing is that AFRICOM, is really moving into Africa and trying to set the tone for the alliances that these African governments have with the United States. And I think there's a lot of consideration that you need to have a second option for geopolitical alignments. It used to be, Russian Soviets versus Americans. Now it's more of a Chinese versus Americans. You want to play one off against the other.
Right. And China, not everybody knows this, but China had a role in African politics for a long time. The North Koreans actually have a role, and they're aligned with Mugabe in Zimbabwe, if you can believe it. But, there was this famous meeting between Mobutu, who was a president of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. I believe he renamed it Zaire. He met with Mao Zedong, and upon their meeting, Mao said, "Man, I've paid a lot of people to kill you." and Mobutu responded, "Yeah, you bet on the wrong man."
Ooh,
and so China has been, having a little role. Now it has a more of an economic role. The Cold War is over, obviously. But nothing's matching AFRICOM. We've done some reporting on this. They're in over 30 countries. They're in the Central African Republic. They have permanent bases. Nick Turse of Tom Dispatch, the footprint in over almost every country in the region. They've had special forces or joint operations. But China seems to be reinforcing its economic relationships, because I understand that they actually are slowly but surely forging some military relationships. Didn't they try to develop a base in North Africa?
Yeah, the old-fashioned, the traditional, I should say, explanation for China's attempts to have influence overseas were basically keyed to economics, investment, corruption, giving stuff away, sending workers over there. But the Chinese have gotten serious about developing power projection now. They got their aircraft carrier, and the only purpose of that is it's not going to fight the Seventh Fleet. It's going to sail around and be there for power on tap, East Asia or South Asia or Africa. They've expanding their Marine Corps, which is used for overseas adventures. They're going to have 100,000 people there. They're developing amphibious carriers. One of the things for China now is that they want to be able to be a military power projecting nation. They'll tend to be careful about it because they basically have to get into the nooks and crannies where they don't directly confront the United States, but they want to be able to say that we can take care of ourselves. One of the things was that it used to be, for instance, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Chinese always relied, when there was always a bunch of hostage taking. The Taliban would take some, guys who were setting up cell phone towers hostage or something like that. But traditionally, the Chinese relied on the local security services to do that. But I don't think they want to do that anymore. I think they want to have their own power projection capabilities, especially in these regions where Chinese interests and Chinese citizens are at risk.
Well, they go hand in hand, right? I mean, that was the whole idea that the Marshall Plan required the Truman Doctrine, because, that was the whole, what's the point of a bushel of wheat unless there's a bayonet to back it up? So China's going to have all this economic presence. They're going to have power projection to secure it, right? Because, unless you really want to, unless they want to rely on the international courts or goodwill or something, right?
They got their hair must have bit in Libya, when I'll have to look into that and see if they were finally able to get some of their money out. But basically, when Libya blew up there, China was the major foreign contractor in Libya, and they had some big projects over there. And one of the things that the United States was doing was sort of holding that compensation hostage to get China to go along with whatever, the United States was trying to do post-construction in Libya. And I don't think the Chinese liked that very much. So I don't know if they would actually go in there and in Africa and do that sort of thing, but certainly when they look at South Asia, they look at Afghanistan and Pakistan. Those are vital. Those are vital Chinese interests, especially because they're worried about Islamic militancy down there. And if they feel those places need to be put in order with direct Chinese military power, I think they're developing that capability.
Peter, you mentioned that they don't want to mess too much with the United States, but in Djibouti, that's a pretty brazen move. They're building a base there. From what I've read, competing for contracts with the local government to rebuild, to actually build. It's not a very developed area as far as I know. I mean, that looks like a direct confrontation.
Well, I see the thing was that the pretext for going into that area was always the Somali pirates. And, so they can always say, well, we're part of a team. That was the first Chinese overseas adventure, was joining these anti-piracy patrols. And just as an amusing sideline, there was something where a Tuvaluan freighter was taken over by Somali pirates, and PRC sent a destroyer over there, and this was, I can't remember, it was someplace off of Africa, obviously. So anyway, so the Indian Navy and the Chinese Navy cooperated in order to, as they say, neutralize this threat. But the Indians credited the Chinese with helping out, but the Chinese were apparently dicks and just said, we did it ourselves. And Chinese domestic media is not reporting that it was a joint operation with the Indians. So they can, I think in Djibouti, they can get away with that because, as I said, it's a locus of the, the East Africa anti-piracy thing.
And the Red Sea and Strait, Mandeb, is it Strait there? Mm-hmm. It's a pretty busy spot lately.
Yeah, I find it hard to get excited about the Djibouti base. It's mainly as a training thing. The other thing that you pointed out was that the Chinese did start to develop a presence in Syria. Again, I don't think that was a situation where they were, looking to project military power in there because it's just too far for them. Basically, the Russians are doing it, but this was a situation where they wanted to show that they were operating in Assad territory, under legal color, thereby buttress the legitimacy of the Assad government. At the same time, everybody's saying Assad must go. And that way, allow him to have another reason to stay on so they could go in there and scoop up these reconstruction contracts.
It definitely seemed like a signaling at the time. Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, they were clear they weren't going to send fighting troops in there.
Yeah, for sure.
But they were going to contribute and, they were going to signal. Speaking of that piece in your China Watch segment where they mentioned Syria and they're making the Aleppo soap for export to China and the Silk Road, do you know if there's a piece of it going through there or one of their ports? Or
the Silk Road is basically the Silk Road went everywhere. If you're looking at the medieval Silk Road, so it's a nice way to give historical color to to justification to whatever they're trying to do there. But sure, you could say it went through Aleppo, and went through Greece. Not really, but I correct me, but I think that the traditional routing was from the Levantine cities to Venice, and then on to Europe. But they're using that. They're really the Chinese really see this sort of anxiety with Trump as an opportunity to cause a realignment of attention and interest from countries throughout Eurasia. Now, Trump stepped back on the TPP, so China steps up. And I don't know about the economics of a lot of things they're trying to do. Just to me, it seems sending stuff by train to London from China is probably not as good as putting it on a boat. But the point is, China's got money to spend, and they're being super aggressive. And the whole idea is that they want to cause this realignment where China is never going to face a united front of, Western powers seeking to contain it again. That's what this situation with Trump gives them. It gives them the time to do some lasting, if not permanent, damage to the whole Clinton-Obama containment strategy.
Yeah, the pivot to Asia is over, right?
They said that. I mean, Pamela, what's her name? Thornton, Assistant Secretary Thornton says, we're not using that word anymore. The pivot is over. Good for her. I was never a fan of the pivot.
So tell us about North Korea.
it's still there, you know.
Trump bragged that 2 shipments of coal turned around and China sent them back to North Korea. But then this morning I read that China warned against using any force in North Korea and said that their trade with North Korea increased. So,
well, I mean, can I actually let's on top of that ask about this quote, which is amazing to me, and this is in the Wall Street Journal. Trump said they hit it off during their first discussion. Mr. Trump said he told his Chinese counterpart he believed Beijing could easily take care of the North Korea threat. Mr. Xi then explained the history of China and Korea. Mr. Trump said, quote, after listening for 10 minutes, I realized it's not so easy, Mr. Trump recounted. I felt pretty strongly that they had a tremendous power over North Korea. What do you think? Unquote. Response?
Well, you know, I have to admit that, one thing I say is I am not a partisan of the Trump is an idiot thing. But every once in a while, he does come up with a few zingers like that. But let me tell you the interesting point, you know, that I've harped on for the last 5 or 6 years is that there's a deep alienation between North Korea and China. And the one reason why I don't worry too much about a war between North Korea and the United States is that the United States and North Korea have been trying to normalize relations somehow, you know, for the last decade. Ever since the neocons led by John Bolton were sidelined from the George W. Bush administration, we've been having behind the scenes contacts and all that crap. And North Korea has been trying to shed the reliance on China ever since it's existed. It started out as a Soviet client, never had good relations with China, but you know, it's basically hung up with those things. And the one point I always want to make is, you know, those nuclear weapons and missiles, they point west as well as east, you know. And one of the reasons that Kim Jong-il and those guys are so keen on developing that nuclear deterrent is they want to intimidate China as well. And China has been perfectly happy to see the United States and North Korea continue in a spirit of hostility because it wants to keep North Korea under its thumb. It basically treats it as a colony for economic exploitation as far as it can go. And so, you know, that's what Xi Jinping explained to him. You know, he says that, if I put he probably said something like, you know, if I put a full blockade on them, they're just going to launch a nuke at Beijing. You know,
what's China's ideal situation or relationship with North Korea, do you think?
Well, they would like to see a peace treaty between the United States and North Korea. And one of these things that I was harping on in my one of my previous China Watch episodes is that once the North Korean threat is diminished by a peace treaty, is that South Korea has a lot less reason to be an enthusiastic member of the U.S. alliance. Basically, South Korean economics and diplomacy is now dominated by China. And what keeps the United States hanging on there, you know, and keeping South Korea from switching to a pretty much Chinese alignment is the fact that there's the United States is the security provider for South Korea, and South Koreans are pretty worried about the North Koreans doing something totally goofy to them. So one reason I think that the United States has always slow-walked peace negotiations with North Korea, well, there's two reasons. One reason is that once you got the North Korean threat, you can keep a lot of allies and military gear in North Asia to contain China while pretending it's about North Korea. But the other reason is that when there's peace with North Korea, you know, the U.S. loses its mission in South Korea.
Right.
And Japan, right? It would hurt the justification for U.S. able to sort of, I guess, stockpile and have a major presence in Japan, wouldn't it?
Well, you know, what can I say? It's always, China is now, it used to be, you know, we pretended that we were an honest broker in East Asia. And that pretty much went by the wayside with the pivot when it was it was clear that we did have a China containment policy, and China is a strategic competitor / adversary / question mark. And the Japanese can always keep the pot boiling by conflict with China over the Senkakus. Those little islands like Taiwan. So I think that I'm not worried about the Seventh Fleet pulling out of Yasukuni or anything like that. But the interesting thing was that it actually came up a few weeks ago, is that if we do a peace treaty or some sort of normalization with North Korea that doesn't involve immediate denuclearization, another problem for the United States is that South Korea will go nuclear to keep a deterrent against North Korea. Right now, they're under the umbrella, the U.S. nuclear umbrella. But if we're making nice with the North Koreans, and the North Koreans are allowed to keep their nuclear arsenal instead of preemptively denuclearizing, then South Korea has already announced they're going to go nuclear, and at least the conservatives in the parliament. And if South Korea goes nuclear, then Japan goes nuclear. And so what does that leave the United States as a strategic guarantor in Asia? The big part of it was always, you guys don't need to go nuclear. We got our nuclear umbrella here. But if everybody's got nukes, the United States position is going to deteriorate. And Rex Tillerson actually referred to that on his trip to Asia. So the U.S. knows about that issue.
What's strange is that Donald Trump, at one point in the campaign, explicitly supported. Now, he went back on that. He said, why do we have to provide security? Let Japan go nuclear. Let Saudi Arabia go nuclear. And why do we have to even do anything? And now he's, I guess, completely 180'd on that, much like he has with NATO today or yesterday. But it was an interesting strategy at one point, and that people, the American people at least, I think this was a position in the Republican presidential primary, kind of said, yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Let's let them take care of their security. Let's let them go nuclear. And then but I think what Trump didn't understand, or maybe he didn't understand, didn't care, but what most people should know is that, American corporate power, that's why America's there. That's why the security rackets are there for the American empire, is they need to keep Asia open, just like the British needed to keep China open way back when. So that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of China's state capitalism overtaking them and eventually pushing them out. Is that a fair assessment?
I'd say I'd have to say, yeah, because when you look at Chinese economic power, it's the largest trading partner of pretty much every country in the world, I guess. I can't even think of, I guess the United States, I'd have to look at that. Maybe Canada still has more trade than China with the United States, but all those countries out there, when you look at places like Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and those, their orientation towards China is increasing. And, the TPP was supposed to turn that around, and make sure that it was American capital and not Chinese capital that was getting all the goodies in those particular parts of the world. So, yeah, containment and hostility to China is a way of keeping the open door open, for American companies out there.
No, I'm just trying to see, for a minute, it seems almost a minute after the Cold War ended and the defense rackets, the military industrial complex, whatever, we're looking for some way to start justifying the defense budget again without the Soviet Union. They started looking at China. This is before the war on terror came up and did fit the bill for a minute at least. Remember, this is when the spy plane went down and there was all this chest beating, particularly among the neoconservative think tanks. That still kind of reverberates a little bit, but just not as present. And it looked like the reason there was a struggle of sorts, because for people who don't know, yes, China's taken a lot of U.S. manufacturing jobs, but export, import, and Wall Street have made a killing in China. So there's kind of these competing U.S. interests about having this relationship with China. What the crossover point is for the more hawkish defense posturing to get to win their seat at the table. They had. Do you remember this period? I guess I should ask that first. Do you remember this period when when China was the new official enemy, or attempts were made at that? This is like the 90s.
I was around in the 90s. I can even remember when the first post-Cold War enemy of choice was drugs. And remember, we were going to go and, take care of drugs in Colombia and all that sort of stuff. And,
Panama, yeah.
Yeah. Dick Cheney was a bear for the China threat. A lot of this strategic posturing goes back to this study that was pointing out that China was going to rise, and it was dependent on oil supplies from the Middle East, and so that drove a lot of the strategy. We had to lock up the Middle East. Believe it or not, the whole Middle East strategy, at least its formal justification for Cheney, was that way, if we controlled the Middle East, we'd have our boot on the neck of China as far as energy was concerned. And so the Chinese had, of course, run with that themselves, and now they're trying to diversify their energy supplies all over the place. But the whole China threat thing was basically baked in from the 90s at least.
Well, and there's a corresponding. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. He's apparently related to the Pillsbury fortune, and he wrote a
guy Pillsbury.
Yeah, and I mean he's actually of that Pillsbury, so I guess he's one of these, guys got a lot of money, so this is what he works on. I don't know, but he wrote this book, which is kind of the polar opposite, where he says there is this. I just want to get you to respond to this. So I'm not saying you didn't hear it, but just which red flag number one right there. But that there's this 100-year plan among the senior Chinese defense to not just break China free and have China be a regional power, but a kind of this is this guy's idea, kind of a world domination scheme almost among that it's their time to essentially run the world, and that he claims, and he's speaks at Brookings Institution, very established places, that this is the actual goal of the Chinese military establishment, which is they don't want to just become the regional hegemon in Asia. They don't want to just call the shots there. They have an actual world domination strategy. Do you buy into that at all? Do you think it's partially true? Do you think it's just, or that maybe they do have it, but the Chinese defense establishment just isn't that much in control?
Well, a boy can dream, as a practical matter, I think that the general drift is that China will achieve parity with the United States militarily in Asia in around 2050, which is, I guess, 30 years from now. And everybody who's writing those reports now will probably be retired or dead by then. I think that the Chinese see that basically before they tackle the United States, they got to tackle Asia, and they have to tackle India. I think that the big story in Asian competition is going to be China versus India. It's not going to be China versus the United States. Maybe in the future, if U.S. policy towards China right now is based on the idea, optimism in U.S.-China policy is based on the idea that China is going to fall on its ass. It used to be we could defeat them handily in a military confrontation. Now we tell our allies in the United States that American institutions, freedom, free markets, and all that stuff are more durable than this rather rickety authoritarian regime in China, and just stick with the United States, and China's going to have a crisis. It's going to fall on its ass. So, but of course, Trump sort of blew that one out.
Right.
And, now maybe, some Chinese guy is saying, America's going to fall on its ass, and, we can move in there. Right now, it's just not practical, and, nobody's, everybody's got plans for everything. But, the idea that the United States is, which still, I think, outspends China 2-1, is going to bend its knee to China, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, is, I think, a little premature. But China, I don't think, is a major expansionist power territorially, but they do want to lick India, and that's going to be their first priority.
I would think the arms manufacturers would not be sad about that, the competition between India and China. Mm-hmm. Both of them gearing up.
Well, one of the big deals in the Obama administration was this totally over-the-top romance between Ashton Carter and India. I got some serious problems with India as a government and all that sort of stuff. But Ash Carter, he was really trying to push India into becoming a formal containment ally of the United States. And one reason is that it's got the heft. It's got 1.2 billion people over there. But the other reason is, that's gonna turn the crank on military equipment. Traditionally the Indians had purchased from the Russians, and this was a chance for us to get in there and get that good old U.S. gear in there.
So, Peter, is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up this interview?
No, it's just great to be here, and I think that we're moving into, as I said in one of my pieces, a post-Trump Asia, and I think it's important to bring perspectives on Asia that are not U.S.-centric into the mix more and more to understand what's going on over there, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to come on your show and talk about it.
Well, we appreciate you coming on so much and enjoyed our time with you.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Peter Lee. You can see him on Twitter at ChinaHand. You can see his reports on China, China Watch, at Newsbud's YouTube channel, or visit his website, chinamatters.blogspot.com. If you'd like to support the show for as little as $5 a month, please visit us at Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire. We'll make a one-time donation, dan@shatterproof.com, at PayPal. Questions, comments, just want to yell at me, dan@shatterproof.com, and please see my and Joanne's work at shatterproof.com. See you next time.